Hi. In this video I'll show you how to start working with databases in .NET 5. The first thing to do is install the Entity Framework Core command line tools. This will allow you to do things like generate and run migration scripts. For this video, I'll use an SQLite database. So I'll install the Entity Framework Core SQLite database provider. Next, I'll create a model class for an entity that we'll store in the database. I'll name the entity person. I'll start off by giving the entity an ID field which will be the primary key by default. I'll give it a string property called name. And an integer property called age. Finally, I'll define another string property called telephone number. To make the ID field automatically generated on insertion, we need to add an attribute to it. This attribute is called DatabaseGenerated. We pass the option identity to it so that it is generated on creation. Next, we need to create a DBContext class. Instances of this class will be used to obtain access to the database. I'll call the context app.dbContext, but you can call it whatever you want. The class must extend from the DBContext class which is defined in the Microsoft.EntityFramework Core namespace. The constructor must take a DBContextOptions that has a generic type that is the same as the DBContext. This object must then be passed to the parent constructor. We must then define all the sets of entities in the database as DBSet properties. The name of these properties will be the same as the name of the table in the database. Now, we must register the DBContext in the startup class. To do this, we call the useDBContext method on the service collection. We can then use the options object in the callback to configure the database provider. The methods and connection strings used for this differs between database providers. In our case, we call the useSQLite method, passing in the database file name as the data source. Now, we can use the Entity Framework command line tools to generate migration scripts to create our database. Before we can do this, we must add the Entity Framework design package to the project. Now we can use the .NET-EF migrations add command to generate a migration. We pass the name of the migration as the first argument. We must do this each time we make a change to the structure of the data model. Now, you will see new scripts to create the database in the migrations directory. To run the migration scripts, we use the .NET EF database update command. Since we are using SQLite, which is a local database, we can see that the database file has been created. This is the file that we specified as the data source in the connection string. If we open the database, you will see there are now two tables, the people table, and also another table used by Entity Framework to track which migrations have been run. If we have a look at the structure of the people table, you will see that it resembles what we defined in the person model. If we have a look at the EF migration history table, you will see that it records which migrations have been run, and that there is a record of one migration in there. As you would expect, there are not yet any records in the people table, because we have not yet inserted any data. To demonstrate inserting data, I'll create an endpoint that will do so. Firstly, I'll create a request model to collect the data to insert. I'll call the model storePersonRequest. The fields for the model will be the same as the person model, but it will exclude the ID field as that is automatically generated on insertion. Next, I'll create a new controller called PersonController. I'll define a store method that will take the data from the request, and insert it into the database. The method will take two arguments, the request from the body, and the DB context from the service container. Next, I'll define the model to insert, using the data from the request model. When inserting a new record in the database, we use the add method on the database context. Finally, the save changes method is called, which will cause an insert SQL statement to be executed. For this endpoint, I'll return the value of the model as JSON. I'll rename the method to store, so we get an endpoint of person/store. I'll now make a request to the endpoint using a REST client. As shown in the response, the new model is returned with a generated ID. We can also confirm that the data has been inserted by checking the database. Now, I'll create another endpoint, called index, which will retrieve all the data. To retrieve data, we simply access the DBSet property on the DB context. We can perform query operations on this using LINQ, which I'll cover in another video. For now, I'll return all the data by not performing any query, and returning it all as JSON from the endpoint. The response has returned an array of all the people objects in the database. In the next video, I'll show you how to start consuming a web service.